Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Let's try that again. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Yeah. All right. Welcome to the Herbert Family University Lecture Series, brought to you from a generous gift from Helen and Jeff Herbert. Thank you and your entire family for making this event possible. My name is Dr. Rich Reddick. I'm the Senior Vice Provost for Curriculum and Enrollment and the Dean of the Undergraduate College at the University of Texas at Austin. Welcome. I'm also a longtime professor in the College of Education and by courtesy, the African and African Diaspora Studies Department. And this semester, I'm also teaching a signature course, or as you might call them, a UGS 303 course called Black Austin Matters. All right. Are you all in my class? That's very impressive. All right. I have presented personally at this lecture series in the past, and I can tell you it was an incredible event, so I am excited to get this event underway. And speaking of this evening, please join me in giving a round of applause to welcome our speakers for tonight's lecture entitled Beyond Debate, Dialogue, Discussion, and Discourse. And I can assure you that what they have prepared for you will be equally engaging and enlightening. I'll introduce each speaker before their lecture, but first, some quick housekeeping notes. Hopefully, you've scanned the QR code that you've been seeing on the slides beforehand. It's right up there. We'd love for you to send in any questions you have during the lecture. So if you want to ask a question when you hear one of the professors speaking, put it in there. We'll get in the queue. Once our third speaker has finished, we will ask you to remain seated for 5 to 10 minutes for a question and answer session that will conclude the evening. Now, we're scheduled to go to 8 o'clock, so please make sure you know that's happening, and please make sure you're staying here for the Q&A. It's very interesting to hear what you are going to ask the professors. Please do not get out of your seats until the Q&A is finished. All right. And so, our first speaker tonight is Dr. Anita Vangelisti. Dr. Vangelisti has recently been appointed interim dean of the Moody College of Communications and holds the Walter Cronkite Regents Chair in Communications and the Jesse H. Jones Centennial Chair in Communications here at UT. Her work focuses on the associations between communication and emotion in the context of close personal relationships. A leading faculty member, she has received the Regents Outstanding Teaching Award from the University of Texas System and the College of Communication Teaching Excellence Award. Again, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this event. At this time, I will turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Dean Anita Vangelisti.
Thank you for that generous introduction. I am excited to be here tonight. My favorite part of my job is teaching and getting to interact with students, and so it's a real pleasure to be here with you all, and I want to thank you all for coming this evening. I have been asked to talk about challenging or difficult conversations in the context of close personal relationships. It's an interesting topic because I think a lot of the time when we consider our close relationships, we would think initially that challenging or difficult topics of conversation would be easier to talk about in our close relationships. Those would be the safe place for them, but lots of times close relationships are some of the most difficult places to have those conversations. So what I want to talk about tonight are a few things. First, I'm going to spend just a little bit of time discussing some of the different types of difficult conversations we engage in. Then I want to talk about what it is about close relationships that make them a particularly challenging context for those conversations. I want to third talk a little bit about the goals that we sometimes enter those conversations with, and then close with some strategies we can implement to make the conversations, if not easier, at least more productive and rewarding. Okay, so let's start out first talking about types of difficult conversations. That's a really important topic and especially timely right now, given the world we're living in. We have an election coming up. We can talk about difficult conversations in a global way, like difficult conversations saying differences in our political views. We can talk about differences in our religious views. We can then we can talk about our different views on the wars that are going on in the world right now, right? But we also can take those conversations more to a personal space and talk about what are some differences in maybe what we think our major in college should be and what our parents think our major should be. We can talk about differences in the way we see ourselves versus the way our friends see ourselves. And so you see in these conversations, a key theme lots of the time is going to be differences. Let me talk about what first type of difficult conversation we can have is one about differences in preferences. Okay, so my little visual there, you can say one person prefers vanilla ice cream, one person prefers chocolate ice cream. That's easy. But we can also have differences in a lot of other kinds of preferences, right? So we can go back to those topics, political preferences, religious preferences, et cetera. For the purposes of this talk, let's talk about differences in our sports team preferences. So what if I'm gonna say, I'm gonna use this, I'm a diehard Longhorn fan, and I'm gonna say, I have a group of friends that are real strong Aggies, and I wanna have a conversation with them about the difference in our preferences. I wanna go talk to my Aggie friends and say, I prefer to root for the Longhorns. That's potentially difficult, but that gets more difficult when we move up the ladder a little bit into a different type of conversation, which is difficult conversations about beliefs. Okay, so if I take my example of a Longhorn fan versus my group of Aggie friends, and I say, as a Longhorn fan, I have a belief that Aggies are generally people that didn't get into UT. Okay? And that's just a belief I hold, and I'm gonna go to my Aggie friends and say, this is my belief. You all really wanted to get into UT and didn't make it. Okay, so you can see quickly that that's a real different thing than just saying, I'm a Longhorn fan, you're an Aggie fan. Now I have a belief, and that belief starts to include some evaluative stuff, okay? Third type of difficult conversation, we're gonna up the ante just a little bit, and we can talk about a difference in values. So I can move that again up a little bit. It's not just my belief that, you Aggie friends, you really wanted to get into UT and couldn't. Now it's gonna be, I kind of think Aggies are not as good of a human beings as Longhorns. Or I think Aggies are not as smart as Longhorns. Now it's a very difficult conversation, right? Because you can see people are gonna get defensive quickly, people are gonna start arguing. The landscape is not as safe as it was when we were just saying, I have preference over here and I have a preference over here, okay? And obviously you can apply those different types of conversations to other topics we were talking about too. Now, what is it about close relationships that makes them a particularly tricky context for difficult conversations or challenging conversations? It's really the qualities of those relationships, which in some cases are the qualities we love about those relationships, but also make it challenging to talk about certain issues. So, quality number one that characterizes a close relationship is something called behavioral interdependence. Behavioral interdependence just means my behavior affects my partner, and my partner's behavior affects me. Okay, so we're talking about close relationships like family relationships, romantic partnerships, real close friends. Your behavior affects each other, right? When you're feeling down and acting grouchy, it affects your friend. I think there I went. My friend feels really excited and happy, that affects me. Your behavior affects each other, okay? So if you're having a challenging or difficult conversation in the context of those relationships, that behavior can be affected mutually during the conversation and after the conversation. Second characteristic of close relationships that's important to note is need fulfillment. We have close relationships in part because they fulfill needs that we have. So they might be need for affection, it could be a need for belonging, could be a real instrumental need, like a financial need. When you have a challenging conversation with a close relationship partner, you risk having some of your needs not fulfilled the way they were before that conversation. Okay? And third quality of of close relationships is emotional attachment. And that is not just your behavior affects each other, but your emotions of each other affect each other as well, okay? So when I feel sad, that's gonna affect the emotion of my friend. When my friend feels really joyful or excited, that's gonna affect my emotion. Again, then you're engaging in these challenging conversations, your emotions are gonna affect each other. It's a different thing if you're having a challenging conversation with a stranger that you're never gonna see again. Your emotions might affect each other there in the moment, but that's a whole different situation than when you're in a close relationship and your emotions are going to affect each other in more of a long-term way. Now let's discuss some of the goals that you can have going into these conversations, because this plays a role in how the conversations play out as well. One goal you might just have is to inform your close relationship partner about your feelings or your views or your values, okay? So I can go into this conversation and say, I'm a Longhorn, I just wanna let my Aggie friends know that I'm a Longhorn. I wanna tell them that. I need to express it and I want them to know it. Okay, that's one goal, not a too difficult goal to achieve. Things might happen as a consequence of that goal, but it's fairly achievable depending on how I enact the conversation. Next goal, though, that a lot of people enter these conversations with is not necessarily just to inform, but it's to persuade the partner, okay? So I'm really gonna have this conversation with my Aggie friends because I really think I need to teach them that they need to be more of Longhorn fans, okay? Same thing when you're talking about political beliefs or religious beliefs. Lots of times you enter those conversations not just to inform your relationship partner, but also you want them to believe what you believe, okay? Third goal you can go into these conversations, and I think you're gonna hear that this is a goal that we're trying to sort of foster a little bit more this evening, is to connect. It's also possible to enter these conversations with the idea that I wanna deepen my relationship with this person. I wanna connect with this person. It's okay if we disagree. I'm not here to persuade them. I want to share something with them so we can become closer, or we can have a different type of relationship than we did before we discussed this, okay? So, if we wanted to have conversations that are challenging and we wanted to do it to connect, what are some strategies that we are gonna need to employ? First strategy, and this sounds kind of oversimplified and cheesy, but I think you're gonna hear this theme too, is to show respect to your conversational partner. That's a big word. Again, it seems simple. It's a lot harder to implement than it is just to say. Part of showing respect to your conversational partner is respecting the space they're in and respecting their right to have their view, which may be different than yours. Okay? That means when you talk about their views and you talk about your views, you're going to be talking about them in very different ways than you would if you weren't respecting their right and space to have their views on the topic. Second strategy to employ is to be empathetic. All of you know what empathetic means. That means putting yourself in the other person's shoes. Okay? You don't have to agree with someone to be empathetic. It's easier to be empathetic if you agree with them, right? Because you're like, well, I know what those shoes are like. I can get in them and I kind of know what those feel like. You can be empathetic and disagree with someone. It's more challenging, and you might be employing one of these. The third strategy I'm talking about is asking them non-evaluative questions. So if you're going to really be empathetic with someone you disagree with, you're going to be caring about learning their perspective. You might be asking them questions about their perspective. Note the word in that phrase, non-evaluative. So you don't want to go up to your Aggie friends and say, why in the world would you ever root for the Aggies? That would be an evaluative question. Also note, some of the evaluation is in your nonverbal communication, because you could say, why in the world would you ever root for the Aggies? That's still a little bit evaluative, but less so than the first way I said it, right? So the nonverbal and verbal communication shows whether you're evaluating the other person. If you can ask non-evaluative questions, that enables you to empathize more and learn more what their perspective is. Okay? Again, you don't have to agree, but you can respect. Those are some ways you can connect to people when you're having those challenging conversations. So take-home points, discussing values is just hard. It's hard whether you're in a close relationship, whether you're not in a close relationship. And it's particularly hard if you differ in terms of those values. If you're all talking about same values with your friends, that's not as challenging. Close relationships can make talking about values even more difficult because you're risking something that you're not if you're having those conversations in a relationship that's more distant. But there's things we can do to make those conversations easier and more productive and more fruitful. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean Vangelisti. Okay. Our next speaker is Dr. Gaylen Paulson. He is an Associate Dean and Director of Executive Education for the McGlone School of Business and an Associate Professor of Instruction in the school's Department of Management. His expertise on how to interact strategically with people, including in negotiations, conflict management, and interpersonal communication, has led to many successful consultation partnerships with leading technology and healthcare corporations and U.S. government agencies. Thank you for being here tonight, Dr. Paulson.
Well, hey, it's nice to see you. My name is Gaylen, and I'm going to give you maybe a business perspective tonight as to how we can work more effectively with people, recognizing that oftentimes fairness is going to be an issue, and we're going to look at how fairness actually is a really difficult thing, both in terms of the outcomes that we get and maybe the processes that we receive. And what I want to look at is how that can affect our perceptions of conflict and our performance in working together. So my interests are really around conflict and influence, and particularly in negotiation. And in a business context, that oftentimes means, all right, how well can I work with you to maybe endure and get through some of the conflicts that we have in a variety of contexts? So what we see is that negotiation actually comes from the Latin. So those of you who studied any Latin, two words, nec and odium. Nec translates as not, and odium translates as easy. So when you're in a negotiation, you're in an environment that is not easy. But what we're doing is we're trying to work through and communicate in a process that's going to help us to reach some sort of a path forward, some sort of an agreement that's going to guide and regulate our future behavior, help us overcome conflict. And you do this all day, every day. It doesn't just happen in official business contexts. It's something that you and I are doing as we're trying to work through maybe some of the differences that we have. And what we want to do is not only to try and capture value or to influence people in our direction, but we also want to use this as a tool to be creative and to come up with better outcomes. There's a classic negotiation story of two sisters who are fighting over an orange. These girls are fighting back and forth, and finally their mother steps in. What does mom say to do? Stop fighting. Cut it in half. And maybe what she says is, you cut and you choose. Now, do you want to be the cutter or the chooser in this process? Be the chooser. You're getting the better half, right? You've never seen a kid so careful with a knife as when they know they're going to get the worst half, right? And so the girl cuts the orange in half. Each girl takes half an orange and they go their separate direction. One girl is in the kitchen. The other girl is in the dining room. The girl in the dining room has a cup. And she takes that half an orange and she squeezes it and gets half an orange worth of juice, throws the rest in the trash. Meanwhile, her sister is in the kitchen where she's baking a cake. You know what she wants from the orange? She wants the rind. She wants the peel. She peels her half an orange for her cake, and she throws the rest in the trash. And both girls, not knowing what their sister had done, you know what they both say to that? They both say, win-win. Win-win deal. Well, what's win-win about getting 50% of what you could have had or what you should have had if only we would have understood the conflict a little bit more clearly, if only we would have maybe dug down and asked the question, why? We could have come up with something really elegant and really cool for everybody. So sometimes we've got to dig a little bit deeper, a little bit deeper. Now, a lot of times what people will say is, I'm not a greedy person. I just want what's fair. Is that you? Right? I don't want to take advantage of anybody. I don't want too much. I just want my fair share. But it turns out that's not easy either. Now, when I was putting this talk together, I think I was hungry because I'm going to give you another food example. So when I was a kid, I would go golfing with two of my friends on Sunday afternoon. And we would play, maybe I'm like 18 years old. We would go on Sunday afternoon at about 4 o'clock up in Wisconsin. If you take Highway 35 out here north 1,000 miles and take a hard right, you're going to hit Wisconsin. You can't miss it. So I would go out with these guys and we'd play 18 holes, right? We'd walk 5 miles, bag on our back. And we would, at the end of the round, go to the local pizza restaurant in my small town, which was called the Pizza Hut. Have you heard of this place? Amazing pizza at the Pizza Hut. And so, people shaking their heads. So we would go to the Pizza Hut, and you can get yourself one of these personal pizzas. Have you had one of these personal pizzas? Maybe cost you like $5, right? $5 for one of these personal pizzas. Is that going to fill me up as a 17, 18-year-old kid just walk for 5 miles? It's like not even close, right? And so we were smart enough kids. What did we do? We pooled our resources together, and we bought the biggest dang pizza that Pizza Hut sold, right? We bought the big old pizza, and maybe that thing cost us $12, right? And the engineering students, where are you guys? They can confirm that those 3 little pizzas, that plus that plus that, is less than that. Is that right? I had an engineering student go on a break one day and go on the Pizza Hut website, and they showed me, the square inches, and they did the math for us. So I can confirm, that's cool. So now the pizza comes over to our table, and the custom at Pizza Hut is that they've got this thing pre-sliced, yes? It's all sliced up for us, and they deliver out a slice to each of us, and now we start to eat. Have you been there? You done that? My guess is you're monitoring the situation. Is that right? You're eating, you're watching, and you're doing the math, and you can see there's 5 slices left, and there's 3 guys, all of whom want extra pizza. None of my friends were the ones who said, you go ahead. Didn't happen. Right? We each take another slice. There's 2 slices left. 3 guys, all of whom want this 3rd slice. Who gets it? Who's going to get the 3rd slice? Right next to you, somebody right next to you. Take 20 seconds. Talk it through. Who's going to get a 3rd slice? What are you going to do with these last 2 pieces of pizza? Talk about it. 20 seconds. Off you go. Good, you're good. Sure. All right, so think about this. We just want to do this in a fair way, don't we? But here's the interesting thing. There's multiple ways that we can try to do this fairly. That what we can do is we can come in here and we try to do it equally. How many have this equal solution, right? Where you're like going to divide each of those little slices into 3, and we're each going to get this little wedge. Anybody have that thing going on? Okay. We might have an equal chance. I heard rock, paper, scissors. Somebody said, right? Well, rock, paper, scissors, equal likelihood that you're going to get a 3rd slice, right? Or maybe you engage in what's called equity, which is not the same as equality. It says equity means that you get equal relative to some metric. So what we did is we gambled for it, right? Did you perform well on the golf course today? This is what you shot. This is what he shot. This is what you shot. Okay, you don't get a 3rd slice. Sorry, buddy. Do better next time, right? This is called equity. You get according to some metric, but it evens out according to those metrics. If you're a salesperson and you bring in $5 million in business, you get paid more than the person who brought in $1 million in business, yes? Equal with respect to something. Then you got need. You got need where the 2 big guys that when I'm playing golf with say, oh, I need it more than you do, little guy. And what does the little guy say? Clearly you don't need it. I'm the one who needs it. What ends up happening is that we start to realize that what is fair, what I think is fair, is what benefits me. And that fairness, because there's a lot of different ways we could interpret this thing, becomes super slippery. Okay? And so sometimes we say in Texas, if you have a dog in the fight, then you really can't be objective about how we do this. Think about this. So when I was a kid, I had a younger brother, 5 years younger than me. Okay? So my mom, how many of you have siblings, brothers and sisters? Where's the only children? Where are you guys? You're not going to understand this, so just kind of bear with us. So my mom would hand me a candy bar. I'm oldest child, right? 5 years difference, I'm 8, he's 3. And my mom would say, hey, share this with your brother. Oldest children, how much candy do I deserve out of this deal? All of it, but I'm going to be fair about this, so I'm going to be equitable, and I'm going to say I deserve 8/11. That's the right mathematical answer to this problem. Is that not true? Youngest children, where are you guys? How much y'all think you deserve? All of it, you're so cute, right? But at least half is fair, is that right? So who we are in a situation determines what rule we want to deploy. And that means that fairness is really hard, because now when I didn't get something I perceived to be fair, I feel like that was unjust. And it makes me super upset and combative even, right? So understand that fairness is a slippery thing, and it's not just one answer that's available to us at any given point, okay? So what do we do then? What we end up having to do is, because we can't always get what we want. There were some economists, right, we say unlimited wants, limited resources. There's some famous economists in 1969, the Rolling Stones, said you can't always get what you want. I can't always give you what you want. So what do we end up doing? We try to treat you fairly in the process. This is something we call interactive or procedural justice, that we may not get everything that we want. And so what really counts then is to say, okay, how was I treated in this process? Did people think about me? Did they hear my voice? Right? In our last little example, we talked about the oldest children, right? We talked about the youngest children. Where's the middle children in here? Yeah, we forgot about you. I'm sorry. But that feels unjust, doesn't it? Like, you're going to get a piece, it's okay. But sometimes we feel like, hey, did I actually get forgotten about in this process? Did people actually take into account my feelings and my concerns? Right? We care about these kinds of respect aspects. We care about honesty and decency. And so what we're looking for here are fair practices. Can you come in here and explain and help people understand how you came to those conclusions, how you made those decisions in a reasonable way? And are you consistent? Are you consistent with how you treat people individually and across people? Are you consistent over time? What people are going to care about, if they don't get a great outcome, they want to make sure that they at least had a good process. So what we're after here ideally is we're going to try and be fair with the outcomes that we deliver, but we also need to be fair with our processes if we're going to keep people in a good state. If we don't do that, it leads to dissatisfaction at work, it leads to poor performance, it leads to fractured relationships, and it leads to bad business. Right? So, a few quick thoughts. Conflict's not a bad thing. Right? If you manage it well, it actually can be something where we can find creative outcomes and do better, like our sisters in the orange. Avoid your echo chambers. We all can find ourselves in echo chambers. We need to explore and to listen and to exchange information in order to find those better outcomes, like our sisters in the orange. Fairness is a subjective thing, that sometimes we get our feelings hurt and we think that there's a right answer. Fairness is oftentimes very subjective and very slippery, and will oftentimes be biased in what looks fair to me versus what looks fair to you. We should assume that people are behaving rationally. Nobody thinks that they hold crazy ideas, right? And so what we need to do is try and understand and be open to understanding their rationale when it comes to why they think what they think. And then lastly, even if you can't always get what you want, you should assume the best about people. And also recognize that we can treat people well, even if we can't always give them great outcomes. We can treat them with respect and dignity. All right, thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Paulson. I'm hungry now. All right. Okay, our final speaker of this evening is Dr. Matthew McGlone. Dr. McGlone is a professor of communication studies at the Moody College of Communication. His work on social influence, persuasion, and deception, with a focus on language's key role in these processes, has earned him many national education and communication awards. His current research projects explore strategic word choice in messaging, stereotyping, and prejudice in interpersonal communication and civility and incivility in social media discourse. Should be interesting. Welcome, Dr. McGlone.
Thank you very much. So, you've heard about how it's difficult to have conversations with close people in close personal relationships. Even though it might seem that those are the people that you can talk about anything with, those can be some challenging conversations. You've also heard about how fairness is in the eye of the beholder, even when you might be able to work out some sort of objective scheme. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about, for lack of a better word, I think I'll call them survival tips for difficult conversations. And I'm going to talk about something that certainly isn't rocket science, but can be really important. And that's asking questions. Now, the interesting thing about asking questions is we normally think of a question as a request for information. And it is that. But when you ask a question, you're providing a lot of information about yourself. Merely asking the question tells the people that you're posing the question to a lot about what you're thinking and what you believe. Sometimes that can serve your interests, sometimes it doesn't. And importantly, you need to think about this. We ask questions. A question can be a way that we can open a door. But the point here is that you want to open a door. You don't want to knock the door off its hinges. And particularly when you're in difficult conversations, you need to be careful about that. Asking questions is important. People love to answer questions. They love to answer certain questions about themselves. And I want to talk to you about how to do that and to use this as a sort of a secret superpower, as it were, particularly in difficult conversations. But first, let me tell you about when I taught persuasion. I teach a course of persuasion. I've been teaching it for 20 years at Texas. But the very first time I taught it, it was at this little liberal arts college up in Pennsylvania. And what I did is I had about 25 students in the class. And what I did is I just drove everybody to this local mall. And we got out and I said, what I'd like you to do is I'd like everyone in the class to go find somebody in the mall. It could be somebody walking around the mall, it could be in a store. And I'd like you to ask this person, I'd like you to talk to this person and get them to do you a favor. I want you to go out and see if you can get somebody to do you a favor. Now, what's interesting is there were a lot of people who wanted to see if they could get extra sauces, for their pretzel. Can you do me a favor? Could you give me extra sauces for the pretzel? Could you sell me 2 of these for 1? Could you do this? Could you do me a favor? And I had these students walking around, and almost all of them started by saying, could you do me a favor? And of course, that's part of getting somebody to do you a favor. But I had some students who would ask other questions first, such as go to a salesperson or somebody and say, how are you doing? How's your day going? What's on sale? How long has this store been open? Is to ask some questions, is to actually start a conversation. The conversation offered this person an opportunity to tell you something about themselves, for them to explain who they are to you, why they're here. And that seemed to be a lot more powerful in getting people to do favors than many of the other strategies that students came up with in the class. Don't start with, could you do me a favor? Blah, blah, blah. Is you could actually ask a few questions about these people. So I want to give you some tips for how to ask questions, particularly in tricky situations. So I look at it sort of in the same way that you look at, say, petting a cat. I realize cats have been in the news a lot lately. I'm not talking about petting cats. I'm not talking about eating them. And of course, when you're petting a cat, you don't want to just make an aggressive move towards it, right? You don't want to make an aggressive move toward it. You want to be very, very careful because you don't want to get swatted. And when you're talking about delicate topics, you want to be careful about the questions you ask. Imagine you go into a conversation and you say to somebody, they've expressed to you that they don't believe in climate change, and you go, why don't you believe in climate change? Or, do you seriously believe that voter ID laws aren't discriminatory? You've provided a whole lot of information about yourself, and you probably put this person on the defensive, right? You've invited them to actually go on trial. You've made it very clear what your agenda is, and that's what a leading question is. A leading question is a question with an agenda. And you are really asking for a fight in many situations, particularly when you don't know how to read the room. You're better off asking an open-ended question, a question that doesn't necessarily put your agenda out there. So you say, instead of, why don't you believe in climate change, which makes it very clear where you sit on this particular topic, you say, what are your views on climate change? Right? You're not asking somebody to defend themselves. You're trying to give them the opportunity to talk about their own views. You say, what do you think are the pros and cons of voter ID laws? Acknowledging that there are different sides to this conversation. You might have your position already decided, but there's some benefit that you get from not putting that out there in your question. By asking it in this open-ended way, you're giving the person that you're talking to the opportunity to tell you about themselves and their perspectives. You are inviting them to share, not putting them on trial. Now, sometimes you want to ask questions as a means for building rapport with somebody. And sometimes you're wondering how much rapport you might want to build with this person and how you'll do it, particularly if you perceive there being a difference of opinion from you. So somebody says in a conversation, and this is the kind of thing that could come up at Thanksgiving, it could come up in a class project, it could come up in a conversation that you hear in a restaurant. Somebody says, I think we need less government and healthcare. Or they say gun control laws don't stop crime. And you might have feelings about this. You might agree or disagree with the statement. And of course, if you have a pregnant pause sometimes in these conversations, that's meaningful in itself. Even not saying something can carry meaning. So you need to be careful. Sometimes you ask follow-up questions as an opportunity to diffuse the situation. Think about it as putting ice cubes in really, really hot water to keep it from boiling over. So you say, that's interesting. What change would you like to see in the current system? To somebody who says, I think we need less government and healthcare. Or you say, what kind of laws do you think would reduce crime? All right, here you don't immediately challenge them. How could you not think that gun control laws wouldn't stop crime? You don't say that. You offer them the opportunity to explain themselves. All right, you don't start a fight. You really try to step on the fuse. It's also important to ask questions that broaden perspective, that acknowledge that it's a big world and that there aren't necessarily two views on something or three views, that there is a broad perspective. And you might do this to explain that to the person you're talking to, as well as express your own interest in the spectrum. So someone says, I don't trust the media at all anymore. Or climate change policies hurt the economy. So they've made a claim. And you're uncertain about how to talk to this person. You might not know, you might not have decided what your opinions are on these things. But if you want to have a constructive conversation and not a fight, you might ask an open-ended question. So you say, how do you think technology is changing the way people get news these days? Or regarding climate change, how do you think countries should balance economic growth and environmental policies? And you've invited somebody to have a conversation here. You have expressed an openness to different opinions that is going to work for you. It's going to make a good impression for you, but it's also not going to put this person on the offensive. It's not going to enable them to make a bad impression for you. You want to create a safe space with your tone. Safe spaces are important for everyone, not just you and the people you agree with. A question can create that safe space, and it can create that safe space. I like to think of it the same way that I think, you're inviting somebody to sit in a comfy chair in a room full of folding stools, right? So somebody says, I think welfare does more harm than good, or fewer regulations would benefit the economy. How do you respond to that? You say, Thanksgiving dinner's been great, I'm ready for dessert. Or I'm ready to go home. No. Tell me more. What kinds of support do you think work best for people? Here you have invited them to explain. You've given them a compliment of saying that I'd like to learn more about what you have to say. Or somebody says fewer regulations would benefit the economy. You might not agree with that. And you say, interesting. How do you think businesses would adapt if regulations were reduced? You're inviting people to participate in this conversation in a way that is not judgmental. Now, I'm not saying that you don't have your own beliefs, you don't have your own biases. We all have biases. But it isn't necessarily in your interest to share them here. Now, later on, you might actually want to have a spirited conversation with this person, but they might take you that much more seriously because you took them seriously. And so all of these things that I'm suggesting to you are simple ways to make that case, is to make that important first impression. And that is a very persuasive first impression by avoiding these leading questions, asking open-ended questions, asking follow-up questions, and creating a safe space with the way that you ask the questions with your tone. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McGlone. Okay, so please stay seated and join me in giving a round of applause to all of our speakers for tonight. Very importantly, now we have questions. These questions are questions that you asked, and we've sort of compiled the best questions together, so you may recognize your question here. So I will ask our panelists the following question. And again, we're going to need about 5 minutes or so just to have this conversation. What should you do if your conversation partner is not willing to engage in the same level of respect that you are?
Am I going first?
Sure. It's a tough one.
That is a tough question, and it's a good question. I think one of the first questions I would ask myself if I was in that situation was, what are my goals right now in this situation? So there are many goals you could have. You could have a goal of, I need to protect myself. Okay, then it might be if that is a primary goal and you have concern over the way that you're being treated or the way you might be treated, you might opt to say, I appreciated having this conversation, but I'm out for now. That's a legitimate place to go if that is your primary goal. Another goal could be, I still want to try to engage with this person. So you could do something, give it a try. There's never any guarantee that one single strategy is going to work, because human beings respond in different ways to strategies, right? But you could say, I want to try to continue and engage, and I'm going to do something called meta talk, which you could say, that meta talk is talking about your talk. So you could say, I really want to have this conversation with you, but I'm not feeling respected right now, or I'm not feeling really great right now, so could we do this in a different way? Would you be willing to do that with me? Give them the chance, I think, going to what you heard the other speakers talk about, give them the chance to invite them in and say, are you willing to do this with me? That would be another completely different perspective to take on it. Me. Toss to you all.
Yeah, I concur with Professor Vangelisti that you have to decide what your goals are, and if you think that the level of disrespect is such that it could, create harm for you, you might actually want to remove yourself from this conversation. But there is nothing wrong with respectfully pointing out that you feel uncomfortable. Perhaps you might even point out what it is that is making you feel uncomfortable, if there's something in particular that you found rude. But also, again, if you, as I talked about, the way that you ask questions, the way that you show your own openness to the perspective that this person has, or to perspectives that are different from your own, make sure that you have, when you're sort of evaluating, you don't feel that you've been treated respectfully. Evaluate the extent to which you might have been disrespectful to their point of view. Sometimes people don't necessarily think their questions convey disrespect when in fact they can. So I think you'd want to balance both of those in making this assessment.
Yeah, I would say that oftentimes what we're trying to do is to have a good exchange of ideas, but unless you actually deal with some of the emotional barriers first, you're not going to get to the point where you're going to explore solutions. And so if someone's emotionally dysregulated, you might ask yourself, has there been some things that I've triggered in this process? Or are there things that I can do to try and address those sources of dysregulation so we can actually lead to a good conversation? And it might mean that we do have to take a break. But in business, we kind of look at saying, all right, I want to have that conflict around ideas. But when it becomes really just about who you are or who I am, then we've got an issue. And so we may need to kind of step back before we start to move toward actually solutions that we're talking about relative to ideas or problems.
Really great responses. Okay, how about one last question? It's a good one. Can you discuss the impact of power dynamics on dialogue and how students can address or mitigate these dynamics in discussions?
Our negotiation person probably should tackle that one first.
Yeah. So we've done some research around power and how people perceive messages that come from powerful people or from low power people. What we oftentimes see is that in negotiation, people feel like they don't have any power. Like, how come you've got all the power? How come I always have the bad role? How come I'm always in a bad spot? The interesting thing is that if someone's willing to have a conversation with you, it means that they perceive that you must have something of value to offer. And so the power imbalance may not be as off as you think. If you go to the CEO of some company and you say, I want to talk to you about this, and then they might say, I have no time. I don't have any time for that. And maybe the power imbalance is too significant. But what we're looking at is, in conversations that we have, the best outcomes and the most creative things come when we actually have a power balance. And if we recognize that you bring power to the situation, I bring power to the situation, don't underestimate the value that you bring to a conversation to find good outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, many people will make an incorrect judgment of the extent to which they have power in a situation. But if you're in one in which you feel that you have relatively low power, the one thing that you can do is take this conversation as the opportunity to build your credibility by showing that you're open to opinions other than your own. So asking open-ended questions and all of the question strategies I talked about would certainly go that, would speak to that. But also your responses to to any exchanges that you get from this individual that you're talking to or other individuals that show that you have respect, for their point of view. You build credibility in their eyes as somebody who can be even-keeled and open to different perspectives. So that can actually build your power, how you behave in this conversation.
Yeah, I think both of those are really great points, because you think of our typical power, when you think of hierarchical power relationships, you think of boss, employee, teacher, student, parent, child, right? But we forget, as the person who's the low power person in those relationships, the person who has the power only has the power because of us who are in the lower power position. And many times that higher power person wants the same kind of acceptance. They want you to listen to them. They want you to participate with them in the conversation too. So that there are certainly times when people in high power positions don't care about that sort of thing. But I would venture to say in most cases they do. And so you, as the low power position, if you're willing to take that time to build your credibility and pay attention to them and ask those questions, that's going to bring you more to that equal level where you can really engage in the sort of interaction you're going after.
That is all great advice that you can use in your lives and your classes going forward. So once again, let's get a hand for our panelists. And I want to thank all of you for attending the Herbert Family University Lecture Series. You've been a great audience. Have a great evening and a great week. Hook 'em horns.
Nice.